Bill, well, you're a nationally recognized expert on high conflict litigation and high conflict personalities. How can you identify somebody who is a high conflict litigant?
Well, what I've really boiled it down to over the years is it really seems that they have four things as key characteristics. One is that they have a lot of all or nothing thinking. So their demands are extreme, eliminate the other person. In parenting situations, it's just eliminate the other parent and everything will be wonderful. It isn't how can we come up with something that's protective, how can we come up with something that's reasonable. It's how can we just eliminate the other person. And often there really isn't a basis or much of a basis for that. The second is a lot of unmanaged emotions. There's impulsive behavior, reaction, blurting things out, a lot of anger, reaction without thinking. Third is extreme behaviors. More examples of lying, manipulating, hiding money, hiding children, just extremes. And the fourth is what I call a target of blame, is they tend to focus on one person and blame them for a lot of stuff that doesn't even fit with them. But they're putting blame on that person. And with those four characteristics, I know it's going to become a high conflict case if it isn't already.
And if the opposing party is not a good problem solver and is not interested in focusing on resolution, but more interested in creating conflict, what suggestions do you have to the party who is rational and problem-solving oriented?
Well, I think what really helps is, first of all, is knowing it's not about you. That it's really the other person's problem, the other person's behavior, and while it makes your life difficult, their behavior isn't something you caused. And so to be able to really relax and go, okay, it's not about me, what do I want to do? Getting support, having a lawyer you can talk to, having often a therapist you can talk to, having people that seem to care about your state of mind rather than here's what you have to do, or just not being sensitive to you. So I think it's being able to separate yourself from that other person. Also getting educated, really learning what's likely to come, what should I be prepared for, what are the common behaviors, because we see with high conflict people very common predictable problems. There's going to be crises. How you deal with them. For example, a client and their attorney need to be able to go, I'm not going to make assumptions. If I'm a client and I hear my attorney's incompetent, I'm going to talk to my attorney. And if I'm the attorney and I hear my client is an extreme wild person, I'm going to talk to my client. I'm not going to make any assumptions and take things for granted that I hear like that. So I think it's kind of slowing it down and having good communication.
Are there particular kinds of personality types that you see ending up in the litigation arena and particularly ending up in the divorce arena?
Yeah, there's two in particular. And what we see a lot of are people with borderline personality disorder or traits, and narcissistic personality disorder or traits. And this could be men or women. Both these personalities are present in some men and some women. But characteristic of borderline personality and narcissistic personalities are a lot of what we call splitting, which is seeing people as all good or all bad. And in litigation, they tend to see themselves as all good, despite having done a lot of things that everyone else would think is pretty bad. And they see the other person as all bad, despite the fact the other person may be quite reasonable. So it really has much more to do with their personality than to do with the other person. But in litigation, everything starts out being just seen on the surface. And so these personalities get quite far, often in the early stages of a case, and sometimes forever if things aren't questioned and you look beneath the surface.
Could you give us just some perhaps easy ways to identify either a narcissistic personality or a borderline personality?
Well, the first thing I want to say is, while I'll talk about characteristics, it's very important that no one say, "Oh, my husband's a narcissist," out loud. You can think it up here, but don't say it out loud. With a narcissist, it's very self-centered behavior. A lot of things are, well, me, and turning things around to be centered on them. They also feel entitled. So if you're dividing up property and a reasonable person says this should be an equal division, a narcissist might think an equal division is 90% to them and 10% to the other person. So they feel entitled, they feel they deserve more. They seem to lack empathy. They don't really seem to care what happens to the other person. And this is also true with children. They don't really have empathy for the children, even though they say, "Oh wow, I care about the children." They don't really show it. It doesn't show up in their behavior. With someone with borderline personality, and I don't use the word disorder as much because people could have some traits and be difficult, and some people with a disorder aren't high conflict people because they don't focus on fighting and conflict and don't end up in court often. Mood swings. Friendly, happy, 1 minute, angry, maybe revengeful the next minute. And it's sudden mood swings. Intense anger. We see that with some women who just very blaming, vicious, cutting, angry statements, and with some men, for example, domestic violence, where there's this build-up and then a rage and then I'm sorry. So there's this intense kind of unmanageable anger that you see. And if someone's been in a relationship like that, when they go through divorce, it often escalates. So if these patterns sound familiar, you need to plan out step by step how you're going to deal with that other person through the whole divorce process, whether it's out of court or in court.
Let's talk a little bit about email exchanges. Most parents end up communicating extensively via email because there's a record of it and it's clear, it helps avoid misunderstandings and ambiguity. But if you're on the receiving end of a 3-page email that's full of diatribes, what advice do you have for the receiving party and how to respond?
Well, I have a very specific method that I call a BIF response. It's brief, informative, friendly, and firm. And the idea is, in response, say, to a 3-page email, is the response may be 3 or 4 sentences, usually not more than a paragraph. And it's brief that way. It's informative. It gives some information related to the issue, but purely just information, like, when the practice begins, or what time pickup needs to be on the weekend, or something very factual and kind of engaging the problem-solving part of the brain. It shouldn't be giving advice, giving admonishments, or even giving apologies, because those feed high conflict people. So I always tell people, be informative, but avoid advice, admonishments, and apologies. Then the F is friendly. The first F of BIF is friendly. So, thank you for responding on this issue. Here's my information. And the last F is firm, is it closes the conversation. It doesn't mean you're harsh with the other person. It just finishes it and says, and that's my request, or that's my thinking on this issue. So that it doesn't give them something to react to. Sometimes it's 2 choices. You might say, let me know, yes or no, by Friday if we can change the pickup time. Or if that's been an issue, then you say, and therefore I accept that we're not going to change the pickup time.
And sometimes I found it takes a while for that practice to work before the other party dials back the antagonism and dials back the hostility. But do you find that it does work in establishing a new pattern?
What I find is it really varies by the person at the other end, but that it doesn't matter what I do at my end, that I'm just going to keep doing this. Sometimes they back off and ease up. Sometimes they back off and ease up for a couple days or a week or two, and then there's a new blast. Because remember, it's about them and their inability to manage themselves rather than about me and how I write. So while it may keep things from escalating sometimes, it won't necessarily prevent them. And I think it's important for people going through divorce, litigation, etc., to know that no matter what they do, the other person may still misbehave. So it isn't that if you did it right, their misbehavior would stop. It's more you're managing your end of the relationship, and that's all you have control over.
Let's talk about managing the relationship with the children, because there is a lot of alienating behavior out there. And when I say alienation, I mean where one parent tries to emotionally influence the child negatively against the other parent. Can you talk a little bit about how you can identify that and what steps maybe someone can take to at least help prevent that or rebut that?
Well, first of all is being self-aware. I think it really helps a parent, because a lot of times parents are doing more of their own alienating behaviors than they may realize. So it's being careful not to be speaking negatively about the other parent. No one can be perfect about that. So if you speak negatively about the other parent, make sure you also speak positively, or use what I call a repairing comment. So if you've said something negative and you say, you know, I just said something negative about your dad or about your mom, and that's not really what I mean. I really want you to have a relationship with them, and I want it to be a good relationship. So one is just being self-aware. Being self-aware about anger and sadness, so that isn't passed to the children. They go, oh wow, mom or dad is crying about the other parent. If that happens a lot, the kids absorb that. And they start feeling like they're either upset with the person crying or upset with the person they think made that person cry. So those are things for self-awareness. If that's happening with the other parent, and you're a reasonable parent and what you can do, I think what really seems to help is just making matter-of-fact part of ordinary conversation how important it is that we have flexible thinking in our lives, and how important it is that we have managed emotions in our lives. Now the kids are going to see that the other parent's not good at handling that, but they're not hearing a direct criticism from this parent. What they're hearing is, you know, what seems to work best is when we have flexible thinking about people. If we just think of them as all good or all bad, we're not being realistic. And so maybe there's a TV show or a movie or a conversation, and fitting those kinds of things into the conversation so that it teaches kids not to slip into taking all or nothing positions about their parents. And the other thing I want to add is really important. It's a recent study about the best parenting skills, and the second most important parenting skill is managing your own stress. And so if parents can show their kids they're managing their stress well, it's less likely that kids are going to get really hooked into being negative about them as severely. because there's nothing really, they're not seeing their parent having a hard time. The other parent often is having a hard time trying to win the child's allegiance, and kids don't like that. It's an uncomfortable feeling. But if they see one parent who's manipulative and trying to get their allegiance, and the other parent dealing pretty well with things and having a lot of positive energy for their kids, it's harder to be alienated against that reasonable parent. So those are a few thoughts, but it often takes also some kind of larger intervention. And so it often does involve going to court, getting some orders that support time with a reasonable parent, and also let the other parent know they've got to watch out for certain behaviors, because it often isn't something just one person can solve.
And as you talk about a larger support group, a therapist obviously falls into that.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how to choose a good therapist? Because I think when you're talking about some of these high conflict behaviors, some of these alienating behaviors, you could end up with a naive therapist who can't recognize what's going on. So how do you pick a good therapist?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Since I was a therapist before I became a family law attorney, I'm very aware that many therapists aren't aware of the dynamics in high conflict divorce cases. And they often get manipulated or just miss a lot of what's going on. So what I encourage people to do is get a therapist who has experience with divorce cases, experience with some high conflict divorce cases where people have really taken sides and gone to court and wanted therapists to write letters and such to the court, so that they know how to balance that stuff, so they don't get hooked into taking sides in that way. The best therapist, if a client says, "How will you work with me?" the best therapist will say, I want to help you look at what you can do to deal with whatever the situation is. I'm not going to focus on the behavior of the other person and agree with you all the time about that other person. I can't really help you if I just agree with you. What I want to do is help you look at what you can do. It's the idea to change the things you can and to accept the things you can't change. But that's mostly someone who's had some experience with conflictual divorce cases will be wiser than someone that goes, "Oh my goodness, the other person did all these terrible things," and stops there. There are a lot of people doing terrible things, and it's how do you help your client cope? How do you help your client balance their lives? How do you help your client be assertive without being aggressive? And also educating, I think it helps if they have some knowledge of personality disorders, which many therapists don't. Therapists in general aren't really trained in personality disorders. But if they do, then they can educate the client about what to expect. So for example, I just talking yesterday with a client a woman whose husband has borderline personality disorder and was actually diagnosed at one point in time. And says, a lot of people don't understand that, but I need information. I want to know what to expect. So now she says, I know, I'll expect crises and to catch my breath and not take it personally. So, and how to set limits and what to tell my child when there's an uproar over visitation, things like that. So it really is mostly having someone who's had experience with these kinds of cases. So if a client goes in and says, here's my situation, how many cases have you had like mine? The therapist should have had at least one case like theirs if they're going to give them really some help.